there is a comforting version of responsibility, the kind that arrives on time, the kind that prevents damage before it happens, the kind that allows us to believe that being careful is enough. But this is not the kind of responsibility that defines Iron Man. Tony Stark's story does not revolve around mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. What defines him is what comes after the explosion, after the unintended consequence, after the realization that no amount of intelligence can rewind time. This is where responsibility becomes uncomfortable. Because at this point, nothing can be fixed, only managed. Every attempt to correct the damage risks creating new damage. Every solution carries its own shadow. And yet, doing nothing is not an option. Some philosophers quietly warned us about this long before superheroes existed. They argued that responsibility does not disappear simply because outcomes escape our control. That moral weight does not vanish when intentions were good. Responsibility, in this sense, is not about success. It is about remaining answerable, even when the answer is incomplete. Tony Stark never gets the relief of a clean redemption. He doesn't repair the world and walk away lighter. He stays inside the problem. He builds safeguards knowing they will fail someday. He creates protections that may themselves become threats. He acts, fully aware that action will never be enough. This is not heroism as triumph. It is responsibility as endurance. Not the courage to prevent harm, but the willingness to carry what cannot be undone. And that is a far heavier suit to wear. There is a subtle lie hidden inside the way we talk about responsibility. We often treat it as a path toward forgiveness, as if acknowledging harm automatically moves us closer to redemption, as if taking action afterward balances the scale. But responsibility does not work that way. Some moral thinkers argued that responsibility begins precisely where redemption fails. When no apology restores what was lost, when no correction equals the original damage, in that space, responsibility stops being emotional relief and becomes something colder, heavier. Tony Stark understands this instinctively. He never behaves like someone trying to feel better. He behaves like someone who knows feeling better is irrelevant. What matters is reducing the next failure, even if the cost is permanent unease. This is why his actions often look excessive, over-designed, paranoid. They are not driven by fear of enemies, but by fear of repetition. Because once harm has already occurred, responsibility no longer asks, "Can this be forgiven?" It asks, "Can this happen again?" And the answer is always yes. So responsibility shifts form. It becomes vigilance without rest, correction without closure, action without the promise of moral resolution. There is no final version where everything is finally safe, only temporary structures standing against the next collapse. This is why responsibility, in its most honest form, is not heroic. It is exhausting. It demands that someone stays inside the system they help destabilize, that they continue making imperfect decisions, knowing perfection is no longer available. Responsibility here is not about restoring innocence. It is about refusing escape, not because it feels right, but because leaving would feel worse. At a certain scale, responsibility begins to change shape. When actions affect only a few, mistakes remain local. When power grows, consequences spread faster than intention. And responsibility stops being personal, it becomes systemic. This is where Tony Stark's burden becomes uniquely modern. Because the problem is no longer whether to act, but how to act without multiplying harm. Protection, at this level, is never neutral. Every safeguard creates dependency. Every system designed to prevent disaster introduces a new kind of fragility. Some philosophers warned that the greatest danger of responsibility at scale is the temptation to replace care with control, to confuse preventing harm with managing outcomes, to believe that enough intelligence, enough oversight, enough design can finally close the loop. But the loop never closes. The more Stark tries to protect the world, the more he realizes protection itself becomes a variable of risk. Not because the intention is wrong, but because complexity always outpaces prediction. Responsibility here is no longer about fixing mistakes. It is about deciding which risks are acceptable. And that is an unbearable position to occupy. Because once you accept responsibility at this level, Inaction becomes a choice with consequences of its own. Doing nothing is no longer morally clean. It is simply another form of decision. So Stark keeps building, not because he believes in perfect solutions, but because he understands something darker. When damage has already been done, responsibility does not ask for certainty. It asks for presence, to remain involved, to stay exposed to the consequences, to keep choosing even when every option is compromised. This is not control disguised as care. It is care that knows it will never be enough and acts anyway. There is a version of guilt that fades with time. It softens as memories blur. It loosens its grip as life moves forward. Eventually, it becomes a lesson instead of a weight. But this is not the kind of guilt that shapes Iron Man. Tony Stark's guilt does not ask to be processed. It does not seek healing. It demands continuation. Some philosophers described guilt not as an emotion, but as a condition, a state that binds action to memory. In this sense, guilt is not something to overcome. It is something to act from. Stark never tries to erase what happened. He never reframes it into growth or destiny. He carries it forward, intact. That is why his responsibility never concludes. There is no final act that balances the equation. No moment where the scale returns to zero. Every choice he makes is shadowed by what came before. Not as paralysis, but as pressure. This kind of guilt does not shout. It hums. It pushes decisions in subtle directions. It narrows acceptable outcomes. It removes the comfort of moral innocence. And once innocence is gone, responsibility changes tone. Action stops being hopeful. It becomes necessary. Not because it will redeem the past, but because abandoning the future would feel like a second failure. This is the most uncomfortable form of responsibility. Not the one that fixes things, but the one that refuses to forget. It does not promise relief. It offers continuity, a commitment to remain accountable in a world where the damage has already been done and will never fully disappear. Responsibility, when it never ends, begins to reshape the person carrying it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, through accumulation. There is a psychological cost to always being the one who must act, to always remain alert, to never fully rest inside certainty. Some thinkers warn that sustained responsibility can produce isolation, not because others abandon you, but because few can truly share a burden that has no endpoint. Tony Stark doesn't withdraw from the world. He stays present. But presence is not the same as connection. When every decision feels consequential, casual choices disappear. Even rest becomes conditional. This is where responsibility stops looking like virtue and starts looking like endurance. Endurance of doubt. Endurance of partial solutions. Endurance of knowing that stepping back is itself a risk. At this stage, responsibility is no longer about moral clarity. It is about tolerance. How much uncertainty one person can carry without collapsing. There is something profoundly human in this tension, because responsibility was never meant to be infinite. It was meant to be shared, contextual, limited. But once damage reaches a certain scale, limits dissolve. So Stark adapts, not by becoming colder, but by becoming narrower. Fewer acceptable paths, less room for innocence, less space for the illusion that things will simply resolve. This is not obsession. It is compression. A life shaped by the understanding that stepping away would not restore balance. It would simply shift the cost onto someone else. Responsibility here is not a role. It is a posture, a way of standing in the world when sitting down no longer feels allowed. We are used to stories where responsibility leads somewhere, to forgiveness, to balance, to a sense that the moral account has finally been settled. But some forms of responsibility never arrive at that point. They do not resolve. They do not reward. They simply persist. This is the quiet truth at the center of Iron Man. Tony Stark does not carry responsibility because he believes it will save him. He carries it because putting it down would cost too much. There is no victory in this posture, no final act that proves the effort was enough, only continuation, Some philosophers suggested that this is where moral adulthood truly begins. Not when we learn to choose correctly, but when we accept that some choices will always echo. Responsibility, in this sense, is not about being right. It is about refusing disappearance, about staying visible to the consequences of what you helped set in motion, about remaining accountable even when stepping away would be easier, cleaner, and emotionally safer. This is why Stark's responsibility never looks triumphant. It looks tired, measured, deliberate. Not because he lacks hope, but because hope without memory is dangerous. There is a kind of hero who stands as an immovable line, unchanged by the chaos around him. And there is another kind, the one who adapts, recalibrates, and continues, knowing that every solution will be incomplete. Neither is simple. Neither is clean. But in a world where damage cannot be undone, responsibility is no longer about saving the day. It is about staying present, staying answerable, staying human, inside a story that offers no final absolution.